Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Dr. Wilcox, the Community Coordinator at the New Jersey Healthcare Quality Institute. The Quality Institute is a nonprofit, multi-stakeholder advocate for the safety, quality, and affordability of healthcare for everyone. The Quality Institute oversees a statewide community health initiative called Conversation of Your Life, which is also known as COIL, and we believe a good talk can lead to a good quality of life. We can't plan when a medical emergency or serious illness is going to occur, but we can always plan ahead. We can talk to those who matter most in our life and to our healthcare providers about what matters most to us if we became seriously ill. COIL aims to engage communities and residents in crucial conversations around what matters most to each of us and how we can plan ahead. We discuss topics such as care options available to you if you were to become seriously ill or were faced with a medical emergency, palliative care, planning ahead with advanced directive documents, and how to communicate your wishes to both those who matter to you most and to your healthcare providers. You can and should get the care that you want and need, no more, no less. And we want to make sure that you have the information and resources you need to help make decisions about the type of care that you want. While we typically hold COIL events in person throughout the year, like many of you, we've transitioned to virtual programming. But rest assured, we're going to continue having these crucial conversations remotely through digital resources, podcasts, and webinars like this one today until we can resume programming in person. Before we begin, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. Please know that this webinar is being recorded and a copy will be posted to our website, www.njhcqi.org/coil later today. All phone lines will be muted for the duration of the program to limit background noise. And you may ask questions by typing into the chat box, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. The topic for today's presentation is having the conversation, planning ahead for the unexpected. And please be advised, it is not the intent of this program or its speakers to provide clinical or legal advice. So today we're honored to have Gretchen Schwartz, MD, MPP, FACS, Morgridge Endowed Professor of Vascular Surgery at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Tacy Silverberg-Urian, RN, BSN, CHPN, end-of-life specialist and founder of Advanced Choices, joining us for today's discussion. After a brief introduction, we will begin today's discussion and afterwards open up for a Q&A session. So Gretchen, when you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be invited. So my name's Gretchen Schwartz, and I'm a vascular surgeon at the University of Wisconsin. And I have two jobs. One job is to operate on people. Most of my patients actually are pretty sick. They need serious operations, and they also have a lot of other medical problems like diabetes, heart disease, lung disease. The other half of my job is as a researcher. And what I research is how doctors talk to patients. And while I can tell you they're working pretty hard to do a good job, I can also tell you from my research that we could do better. And so I get to start before Tacy because I'm going to talk today a lot about what these crucial decisions start to look like. And then Tacy's going to help you think about how to plan to make some decisions when you or your loved one becomes very sick. Dapa, can I have the next slide? So I spend a lot of time audio recording surgeons and patients talking to each other, but there's this lovely expression and it says, if I don't show you data, you won't believe me, but if I don't tell you a story, you won't care. So I'm going to show you some data, but I'm going to start with a story. And this story is about a colleague's patient. She came to our hospital several years ago at this point, and she is a bit older. She was in her late 70s, but she had a lot of health problems. She had lung disease, she had kidney disease, she had bad arthritis, and she was just barely making it at home. She came in with a big aneurysm, that's a ballooning of her artery, and it was about to bust. It was in her chest and her belly. And my partner sat down with her and her family because he was very worried that surgery would not go well for her. And he said, if we do surgery, you have a 50% chance of dying. If we do surgery, you have a 60% chance of being on dialysis after surgery. And if we do surgery, you have an 80% chance of being on a ventilator long-term after surgery. He said, another strategy we might think about is to focus on your comfort and let other people gather and make sure you're comfortable, because I worry that this aneurysm is going to have you die. And she and her family thought long and hard about what to do, and ultimately they decided to go forward with surgery. So the next day he took her to the operating room. They spent about 10 hours in the operating room. This is a really, really big operation. And the next morning she was in the ICU. She had tubes in her mouth. She was puffy, but the surgery team came by and saw her, and they thought she looked pretty good. She was doing as best as we might hope for. Dappa, I'll have the next slide, please. A few hours later, her family came in the room and they saw her, and she couldn't move. She couldn't squeeze their hand. She was totally puffy, and the nurses were there's tubes coming out of everywhere. And they looked at her and they looked at the team and they said, this is not okay. She never would have wanted this. And they asked him to stop doing all of these life-sustaining treatments. Next slide. So if I had to describe to you what went wrong here, because I think my colleague was really trying very hard to help them make the right decision for her, is that surgeons have not been taught to help people make this decision well. And when surgeons are telling people you have a 50% chance of dying, then people hear, well, you have a 50% chance of not dying. And if they say, if you have a 60% chance of needing dialysis, then they think, oh, well, you have a 40% chance of not needing dialysis. And an 80% chance of being on a ventilator means a 20% chance of not being on a ventilator. And they just did the math and said, well, I have a 20% chance of being just like I was before surgery, after surgery. When all of us surgeons know that that was never possible. She was never going to be the same again, even if we could get her to survive. And I think there are a lot of stories like this. All of these articles that I show in front of you are stories of how patients and families were very upset that the kind of care that they received at the end of life was not consistent with how they wanted to be cared for at the end of life. Next slide. And a lot of this has to do with us doctors who don't do a very good job explaining what it would be like to go through surgery, what it would be like to have a major operation or treatment like chemo, or what it means to actually survive. It's not necessarily being exactly the way you were before, because we say, well, your liver functions look like this, or your chest x-ray looks like that. Next slide. Surgeons also say things like, you have a blockage and my operation will fix it or go around the blockage. Or your valve is too tight and we'll put a new valve in. Or we'll take out your esophagus with the cancer and we'll use your stomach to make a new esophagus. And I have to tell you, that sounds great. It sounds like you have a little problem and we're just going to fix it. And yet when people are not the same after surgery, we haven't communicated very well to say, is this okay with you? Is it worth it for you? Next slide. This is what the data in my lab looks like. And I would say that this is a wonderful surgeon who's trying really hard to explain what surgery is like when this surgeon wants to take a cancer out of somebody's pancreas. But honestly, if I were a patient listening to this, A, I'd be totally lost, and B, trying to understand how the plumbing inside of my abdomen is going to be reorganized is not actually helpful for me as a patient to think, is it worth it to me to go through surgery? Because you haven't once told me what my life is going to be like. How will I feel after surgery? What will I be able to do? How long will I live after surgery? How long might I live if I didn't have surgery? The surgeon says at the end here, oh, worst thing that could happen is that you could die. But I might also be worried that worst thing that could happen is that my quality of life could change so much that I wished I was dead. Next slide. When we interviewed patients before and after they talked to surgeons, and then before and after their surgery, patients were often very surprised at how surgery went based on the conversation they had with their surgeon. They felt that they absolutely had to have surgery and they were not presented with choices. They were surprised that even though the surgeon said they would fix their problem, and maybe they said there were risks, they didn't understand how hard getting better might be, or that they weren't going to get back to the way they wanted to be. And then finally, and I think this is the point that Tacey's going to really draw out, is that if we don't tell people what matters to us before a major operation or before a serious illness occurs, then it's going to be really hard on our family members to know what to do when it happens. And, our patients, when we talked to them before surgery, said, oh, they know how to take care of me. They know I don't want to be a vegetable. And then after surgery, we did have a few patients die. And when we talked to their family members, it was so distressing to them because they didn't know what to do. And even though they were okay that they had made a decision, they felt it was so hard for them. And that if we plan ahead and can give our loved ones some ideas about what is and what is not okay with us, they may not feel so distressed in these moments. Next slide. So one of the things I do is try to teach surgeons how to do better. And this is one of our interventions. It's called best case, worst case. And if you want to, there's a little video that goes along that has some of these pictures in it and it describes it a bit more. That's the link there on the bottom. And instead of using things like a 50% chance of dying or a 60% chance of needing dialysis, we ask surgeons to tell a story. So if you're in this position where you are with a loved one or you yourself need to have major surgery, ask your surgeon, what does this look like if everything goes well? Tell me a story about the best case scenario. Because that woman I told you about at the beginning of my talk, I might have told a story that said, she's going to need to be in the operating room for 10 hours. And then after surgery, she's going to need to be in intensive care with a breathing tube, maybe even some dialysis. And she'll probably need to be there for about a week or so, and then probably another few weeks in the hospital. And if we're really lucky and everything goes as well as we might hope, maybe we could get her to a nursing home afterwards. And I think that's the kind of information people need to make decisions, because then they can imagine what it would be like to go through treatment. Next slide. And so this is what we teach our surgeons. Please tell a story of what it looks like in the best case scenario. Tell us a story of what it looks like in the worst case scenario. And I have to tell you, the worst case scenario is not that patients go to the operating room and they die on the table, because I have been a surgeon for 25 years and I've been in 2 on-table deaths. It just doesn't happen. We are almost always able to get people out of the OR and into the ICU. So when we say you might die with surgery, what we mean is that we'll get you to the ICU, but after 3 weeks in the ICU with complication after complication after complication, we'll need to sit down with your family and figure out whether it's reasonable to keep going. That's the worst case scenario. Next slide. And I think this is the really important part about advanced care planning, is that oftentimes doctors and other clinicians will say, well, what's important to you now? Or how are you thinking about this? And as a family member and as a patient, it's really hard in the moment to all of a sudden know what to do. But I think when people are sick and they're in the hospital, it just feels like they're just being bombarded with decision after decision after decision. And so having conversations ahead of time will help you answer questions like this. Next slide. The other thing that we've done in my lab is to try and prepare patients and their family to talk with surgeons. And one way to do that is to put together a list of questions that you might want to ask when you're talking with whoever's taking care of you, whether it's a surgeon or somebody who is providing medicines. Next slide. And you can see this is more data from my lab. This is a lovely neurosurgeon. He's talking about taking out a brain tumor. And he says to the family, "What questions do you have for me?" And the patient says, "Well, I want to know if I can wash my hair," which I can understand why that's an important question. It seems like such an important question for the family member. And the doctor goes on and answers those questions. Next slide. But it seems to me that there are actually more important questions than just things about that you can imagine, like staples and shampoo, right? There are big, larger questions about surgery. Will it help me? Will it help me live longer? Will I feel better after surgery? Sometimes we do surgery just to find out what's wrong with somebody, and it's really important to know that that's why we're doing surgery. And some surgeries will keep you from getting sick in the future. But if you don't know these things, it's really hard to figure out whether surgery is right for you and whether it's worth it. Next slide. So we actually had a group of patients and family members who had had surgery, and they helped us come up with a list of questions you could ask your surgeon. Next slide. And they run along the lines of those choices. Should I have surgery? What does it look like when everything goes well? And what happens when things go wrong? And I think this is a nice lead into Tacey's talk, because you can see that third panel, what happens if things go wrong, is exactly the kind of stuff we want to do when we think about advanced care planning. If I'm too sick to speak for myself, how can you make sure you know my wishes? If I decide to appoint someone to make my medical decisions, what do I need to do so that is official and you know who to ask, right? So it's these kinds of things about being prepared, showing up to ask the questions you need in order to figure out if treatment is right for you, is the way I think we can help patients and surgeons make better decisions. Last slide, please. So I know it's really hard to be in this virtual format, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. But if I don't get to your question or you wanted to ask another question, my email address is here. And then we have several other resources online. They're mostly to help doctors do a better job talking to patients. But I think patients and families can learn from them and know what questions to ask when they go in for treatment. Thank you so much for having me.
Right, I'm going to get my act together here and share my screen. If you give me just a moment. All right, here we are. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I loved your presentation, Dr. Schwarzy. Hi, my name is Tacey Silverberg-Urian, and I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse, which means I specialize and am an expert for patients and their families that are seriously ill or have a terminal illness. I'm also the founder of Advanced Choices, where we're committed to educating the public on the criteria, the benefits, and resources about hospice and palliative care and the importance of advanced directives. I'm also on the steering committee of New Jersey Hospice and Palliative Care Group, and I have a history of over 40 decades as a registered nurse, administrator, a strategist, and author of a book about the importance culture plays at the end of life. I'm also a baby boomer who wants to write death. I've provided hospice and palliative care in the community, in the homes, in hospice residences, skilled nursing facilities, and in the hospital setting as a direct care provider, liaison, and as a hospice administrator. I've now transitioned to community education, and the goal of my practice is to ensure that our community members understand their options and communicate these care wishes to those who matter most and their healthcare provider. The next best step is to document these wishes. So if there ever comes a time that you cannot communicate, your families will have this guide and not have to guess what your wishes are. It's like a gift. I have a personal story I'd like to share. Just like Dr. Schwarzy says, sometimes you'll remember what I'm really trying to say if I share this story with you. I have a relative in a situation right now. She was hospitalized for a depression. She also had a history of Parkinson's disease. And during this hospitalization, she was infected with COVID. And nobody in her immediate family expected her rapid decline to the point where she is now, unresponsive, unable to communicate. She can't get out of bed or eat. And her husband is her healthcare proxy, but left all the medical decisions up to the son, who is a physician. Her other son does not agree with the medical decisions, and this is causing anger, tension, anxiety, and animosity. And believe me, this is a familiar scenario that plays out every day. So I'm so glad you're attending this webinar to learn how you can take control of your narrative by planning for the unexpected. The goal of my presentation today is for you to become more comfortable talking about your care wishes and documenting them. I'm going to share some strategies on how to communicate these conversations with those who matter to you most and your healthcare providers. And I'm going to review my favorite tools and resources that I use. When it comes to talking about death or dying or end-of-life wishes, very few people have done this. Did you know that according to the Conversation Project, 92% of people say that talking with their loved ones about end-of-life care is important, but only 32% have actually done so. Other surprising statistics include that 21% of people say they haven't had the conversation because they don't want to upset their loved ones. And 53% say they'd be relieved if a loved one started the conversation. And 95% say they are willing or want to talk about their end-of-life wishes. So you're probably asking, why is this gap? Based on what I hear from the community, it appears that there's a need for education. These are the top questions that I get asked when I'm out in the community. How do I prepare for these conversations? Or whenever I've tried to talk to my adult children about it, they don't want to talk about it. What are some good conversation starters? There's so many different forms, I'm confused. Or where can I get advanced directive forms? And what's the difference between an advanced directive and a living will? I'm going to answer these questions today, but remember, there's no guide and no single conversation that's going to cover all the decisions that you and your family may face. Let's face it, who wants to talk about death and dying anyway? And it's no surprise because we live in a death-denying society. And most of us either don't know how to start this conversation, don't know enough about the subject, or it's too hard to face one's own mortality. We're afraid that if we talk about it, it might somehow jinx us. We don't even have a language to speak about it. All of these reasons are legitimate reasons for avoiding this conversation. Being a nurse and seeing so many of my patients and families unprepared, not knowing what their loved one preferred or valued, was difficult. I witnessed families in conflict and guilt-ridden with their decisions. So when I retired last year, I decided to help the community understand the importance of talking about and sharing what is important at the end. I've been a dedicated volunteer for New Jersey Healthcare Quality Institute's Conversation of Your Life for these past 2 years, providing community forums pre-COVID in person, and now this year doing webinars. So today, I want to help you identify a strategy to communicate your end-of-life wishes or your advance directive to your family and your provider. I'm going to share 2 tools. The Conversation Project's free booklet called Your Conversation Starter Kit and Aging with Dignity's 5 Wishes document. Many have found these tools helpful to begin talking about how they feel, about what's important to them, while moving toward documenting their care wishes. The starter kit does not answer every question, but it helps you get your thoughts together to have the conversation. You can use it whether you're getting ready to tell someone what you want, or if you want to help someone else get ready to share their wishes. It's not intended to be completed in one setting. It can be used over the course of many conversations. All families are different when it comes to talking about dying. I was incredibly lucky. My mother was practical and a religious person when it came to talking about death. And she was pretty much in charge of my parents' healthcare decisions. She took control and made sure they received the care that they wanted. At age 90, my dad suffered a stroke, and he ended up in the hospital. But based on previous conversations, she knew that he did not like hospitals. So she made sure he was brought home on home hospice once it was determined that he had less than 6 months to live. And hospice covered the cost of his medications, his hospital bed, medical supplies, professional and paraprofessional visits to help us care for him at home. He died peacefully, surrounded by our entire family. Both my parents died at home with hospice services. Although her wishes were not written down, she verbally made sure that we, her adult children, and her healthcare provider knew exactly what was important to her and how she wanted to live life at life's end. The free booklet can be downloaded and printed, and it looks like this. It'll come in pages. And once you have it, all you have to do is follow along, answer the questions, and remember, you don't need to complete it in one setting. And don't be surprised if your family runs away from you each time you try to bring up the topic. That's pretty normal, but eventually it will happen. So let's take some time to review some of the questions and recommendations to help you begin thinking about strategies and tips on how to start the conversation using this tool. So let's start off by asking, what do you need to think about? Or what do you need to do before you feel you're ready to have the conversation? Do you have any particular concerns that you want to be sure to talk about, like making sure finances or a particular family member is taken care of? They even suggest writing a letter to yourself, a loved one, or a friend. The main thing is that you begin thinking about it. You might even practice having a conversation with a friend. Remember, it's not a one-time thing. It's the first of many over time. My mother began sharing years before my dad was hospitalized. She would randomly say things like, in her Filipino accent, "If I get sick, I can no longer take care of myself or feed myself. I don't want to stay in the hospital. Take me home." Or she would say things like, "You know, when I die, this is where you will find the information about our burial plot, our bank accounts, who to call, etc., etc." And all of us adult children would say, "You're not dying yet, Ma. We don't want to hear that." But you know what? She planted multiple seeds, and over the years, all of us adult children were on the same page and knew what was important to her at life's end. Here's another question. Fill in the blank. What matters to me at the end of life is, and some people write down things like being able to recognize my children, or being in the hospital with excellent nursing care, or being able to say goodbye to the ones I love, or that I want to make sure I'm not suffering. Then the next 2 pages in this booklet include statements to choose using a scale from 1 to 5 based on how you feel. I'm going to review 4 statements. For example, number 1, as I receive care, I would like my healthcare team to do what they think is best, and you would rate that as a 1. Or to have a say in every healthcare decision, and you would rate that a 5. Or you may want something in between, so you would rate it a 3. Number 2, Another statement is, if I had a terminal illness, I would prefer to not know how quickly it's progressing or know my health provider's best estimation for how long I have to live. Number 3 example, when it comes to privacy, when the time comes, I want to be alone or I want to be surrounded by my loved ones. Scale from 1 to 5. Number 4, how long do you want to receive medical care? Indefinitely, no matter how uncomfortable treatments are, or the quality of life is more important to me than quantity. I can honestly say that based on conversations with my mother, she would have responded 5 to all these statements. There was no guessing, no disagreements. We adult children knew what she valued. This is the beauty of taking time to think about what's most important to you and then share it, just like my mother and many others have done. And once you complete these pages, then there's a few more questions, like, who do you want to talk to? It's different for everyone. Could be your partner, your dad, mom, children, sister, brother, faith leader, a friend, your healthcare provider. And when would be a good time to talk? The next holiday, before I get sick again, at the next family gathering, the next time I visit my parents or adult children. Different for everyone. And where would you feel comfortable talking? At the kitchen table, on a walk, sitting in the park. So here are some suggestions many use to break the ice. We know how difficult and uncomfortable this is, especially if it's your first attempt. Many say they make an appointment with the person they want to share with. It makes it easier than springing it on them. And lastly, you might want to practice with a good friend or a family member. Here's some of the icebreakers I've heard people use. I just completed this form about my end-of-life wishes, and I want you to see my answers. Or, remember how so-and-so in the family died? In your opinion, was it a good death or a hard death? I want to talk about that and about what's important to me. Remember, be patient. Some people may need a little more time to think. Every attempt at the conversation is valuable, and nothing is ever set in stone. You and your loved ones can always change your minds based on the circumstances. And once you've taken the time to think about what's important to you, you'll feel more comfortable with having this conversation with whoever it is important to you. Then your next step is to record your wishes in a document known as an advance directive. There are many types of medical advance directives, including my favorite called the 5 Wishes. I will post that link and other helpful links at the end of my presentation. Medical advance directive and living will are used interchangeably, and they mean the same thing. And there's various medical advance directive documents, and I like this one, the 5 Wishes, because it not only addresses naming who your healthcare proxy is and which medical interventions to continue or stop, it goes beyond that. So let me review the specific 5 wishes to show you what I mean. Many people think that you need a lawyer to complete an advance directive, but you don't. As long as you have 2 unrelated people sign the document who witness your signature, it then becomes a legal document here in New Jersey. So just briefly, wish number 1 is about choosing a healthcare agent. Your healthcare agent is also referred to as a healthcare proxy. This is the person who's going to speak on your behalf if there comes a time when you're not able to speak for yourself. It could be your partner, an adult friend. It doesn't need to be a family member, but it should be someone who you believe can honor your wishes. Wish number 2 asks you to think about the kind and how much or how little medical treatment you will or won't want. Number 3 is about comfort. It includes things like how you want your pain managed, or your depression or nausea addressed. Do you want your favorite music played? Do you want to be massaged with warm oils? What makes this form so easy to use is that it lists multiple interventions, and all you have to do is cross out anything that you do not agree with. Number 4 is how you want people to treat you. For example, do you always want people present with you, your hand held? Do you want prayer? Do you want to die at home? And wish number 5, what do you want your loved ones to know? For example, I want them to know I love them. I want them to respect my end-of-life wishes, even though they may not agree with them. This wish includes your funeral or memorial wishes, and if you opted for and talked to your MD about medical aid in dying. Next, make several copies, one for you, one for your healthcare agent, your family members, and your primary care provider. And on the New Jersey Healthcare Quality Institute website, there are webinars that walk you through completing your 5 wishes in a lot more detail than what I just did. In summary, I hope that I've given you enough material to start thinking about what you need to do and strategies to begin having this conversation with someone who matters the most to you. That could be a friend or a family member. The important thing to remember is that it's never too early to begin this conversation. Please do yourself and family a big favor and begin to think about your care wishes, and then share and document them. I like to say that it's like a gift to guide them to do what is right for you. So here are the sites that I mentioned to you earlier where you can learn more about completing your advance directive and my 2 favorite tools and resource. Here's the New Jersey Healthcare Quality Institute. There's New Jersey Coalition on Goals of Care. They have great helpful tools. And the New Jersey Department of Health, it has the medical advance directive forms and a lot of information on end of life. And my favorite 2 tools right there are the Conversation Project Starter Kit and the 5 Wishes. And I thank you for attending, and I look forward to your questions. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dagmar.
So thank you, Gretchen and Tacey, for all of that helpful information, as well as these powerful stories. So before we open it up to the audience for questions, a quick reminder that this webinar will be available on the COIL webpage so that you can review the information you may have missed and can share it with your family members and friends. We have other resources available for you too, such as our advanced care planning, preparing for the unexpected one-pager, where we have compiled trusted resources, all accessible from home, to help you think about your wishes and strategies for how you can comfortably approach these important conversations with those who matter most. We encourage you to take a look at this document and share it with your family and friends, and stay tuned. COIL will continue to push out resources for residents and healthcare providers. So let me open up the questions to see if we have any for you guys. Oh, one moment. So before we get to audience questions, there is one question that I have. I've noticed that in my personal experience, talking to friends and family members about advanced care planning, they're very familiar with all the aspects about advanced care planning, but once I say advanced care planning itself, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So if one of you guys could explain what advanced care planning is and why it's so important, especially right now during COVID.
I can answer that if you'd like, or do you want to, Gretchen?
I think it's so up your alley. You should answer it.
Well, people get, advanced care planning and living will confused, and I've, even people in my family, they think, oh, it's like a will. No, it isn't. It really is about thinking through, if you aren't able to speak for yourself and you're seriously ill, that you have a document that people can look to that will guide them as to, you've given it thought, like, how do you want to be treated during this time? And it's so important to do. I have taken care of so many patients, and in the intensive care unit, you know, the family is sitting around and their loved one's hooked up to the ventilator and they've got tube feedings going in and they're swollen and they're not able to talk and they just don't know, what would she want us to do? And then you have the son flying in from California that wants everything done, you know, because he hasn't been around to see how mom has been deteriorating. So then you have all this animosity with family members. But if you write it down, then there is a guide. It's like a gift, you know, to tell us, you know, what is it that was important to you? And so what I do say to the family members at this point is, you know, if your mother or your father could sit up right now in that hospital bed and look at you in the eye, what would they be saying to you? You know the essence of your mom or your dad. And that's how that's going to help guide you in your decision. And in fact, that relative that it's in the hospital right now, and they've now gone from a tube feeding in the nose to a putting a gastro tube in her stomach. You know, the family is just really unhappy because they can't decide what to do. And I said to the younger son, who's much closer to her, you know, what would she say to you? You know, so it really is a gift. And that's why it's so important for you to write it down.
Thank you. And we have some more questions coming in. This one's for Dr. Schwarzy, well, Gretchen. Aren't doctors reluctant to prognosticate on surgical outcomes for fear families will hold them to every word?
Yeah, I saw Bonnie's question in the chat, and it's a really nice one. I think doctors are nervous about saying this is what I think is going to happen, in part because there's always uncertainty, right? There's always a range of what might happen. And so we use probabilistic language. There's a 50% chance of this or an 80% chance of that. And I think that's really hard to interpret. And I think if I were a family member, what I'd like to know is from my doctor is, I can't predict the future. I mean, honestly, I'd be the best doctor in the world if I had a crystal ball, but I don't have a crystal ball. And so what I need to say is, given that I don't have the ability to see in the future, I can tell you that this is the range of what's possible. And when I think about you, or I think about your mother and doing surgery or having chemo or getting hospitalized and being on a ventilator with a pneumonia, this is what I'm hoping for if everything goes well. This is the best we might hope for. And to describe a story of what it would be like to get better from pneumonia, because it's not just like all of a sudden tomorrow you're better. There's a story that's attached to this. And this is what I'm worried about. This is what it might look like if things don't go our way. And given I've showed you that there's boundaries around the limits of what's possible, I could say what I think is most likely, given my experience, maybe it's close to best case scenario. Maybe it's closer to the worst case scenario. And I think, Bonnie, that doctors are more comfortable prognosticating in ways like this because they say, I can't tell you for sure, but I know there's limitations around what's possible. And I have some idea of how this might go down because I've been a doctor for a long time. And I know certain things about your mom. And so you're right. I think they're very nervous about saying this is what's going to happen. But maybe we could teach them to say there's a range of possibilities. And what I think is most likely isn't necessarily the best we could hope for. We could maybe hope for something a little better than that.
Thank you. And we have one more. What are some strategies to start these conversations with parents or family members over FaceTime or Zoom when it's harder, like especially in this new virtual world?
I can just, we've been doing a lot of Zoom things. Like I've set up like a weekly Zoom meeting with my brothers in Chicago on a weekly basis. We've never been closer. But, you know, what is wrong with setting up an appointment on Zoom? You know, if we're all really social distancing or living in different states, you know, I think that right now we're in a good place in terms of people facing their own mortality. That it's not, you know, death and talking about death plans has never been a popular topic. But I feel that because of COVID and, you know, death has touched many of us this past year, that we're beginning to think about it like, you know, it's a regular life cycle, you know. And it's, you know, part of, it's just like birthing and dying. There's a beginning and there's an end. And if we develop some kind of a death literacy, we talk about that, you know, where it becomes like a normal thing to talk about. I think that we would get closer, we'd move that needle. And in fact, I think over the last couple of years, we have moved that needle. You can see more articles in the New York Times about end of life, as well as books that are being put out there by physicians and, you know, amazing books. But, you know, as far as sharing with family members during this time when we're social distancing, I would say, you know, set up an appointment on Zoom, you know, and have that conversation. Have your medical advance directive or your 5 wishes in front of you and say, hey, you know, this is really important to me. And I want to make sure that you know what's important for me at the end if I can't speak. You know, like really, this is a definite gift to your family.
I love the way Tacey talked about that. I really think both in your talk and how you just said it now is super helpful. I also think that, you know, this opportunity Tacey's talking about, when we see people on TV on a ventilator, when we see hospitals where there are lots of sick people and they're doing a lot of invasive therapies, you don't have to, if you're really nervous about your loved one, you don't have to hit it head on. You could say, did you see that? What do you think about that? How would, you know, and then if they're okay talking about that and they can start talking to you about what they think, about what they saw those people on TV going through, then you can say to them, well, what if I got sick? What if you got sick? How would we know what to do? And so I think that, you know, Tacey's point that this is an opportunity, yes, it's not an opportunity we wish we had. We'd love to not have this opportunity. Simultaneously, when you see things that you share with your family, it's an opening to say, I need to know what you think about that. It doesn't even have to be for them in the moment, right? But understanding their thoughts gets you a little bit closer to how they may respond if it happened to them.
Thank you. And we have another question. Are advance directives portable or honored if you become ill or pass away outside of the state or outside of the country?
I can't speak for outside of the country, but for sure they work outside of the state. And honestly, what happens when we don't have a living will or an advance directive, again, they're the same thing, is that we just ask your family members. Right? And so any information that would help us try to figure out what to do when you can't speak for yourself is information we're going to want to have access to. And so the hard part about not having one is we're still going to ask your family members, and then they feel very lost. And as much as we try to help them, that's really hard on them. So yeah, they go across state lines. I think it goes similarly in other countries, but I can't speak to that with as much authority.
Got it. Thank you. We have another one. What are any strategies that you've seen for getting nursing home leaders to engage families in these conversations?
It's just, I guess the same question can be asked about hospital administrators. You know, it's really about leadership and about education. And Having worked as a nurse in a hospital setting, having to, care for patients in skilled nursing facilities. A lot of these things, if you don't have, like I say, an enlightened physician and a physician that kind of is not afraid of talking about end of life, that it really has to come from the family to bring up the topic, unfortunately. I've seen that, opposite, where there's tension in the hospital because of a physician's belief system versus, what the family wants. And then we're asked to step in to be like a referee or be an advocate for the patients. So, it's just like we felt like, oh, maybe there will be a change of tide when Medicare started incentivizing physicians to have the, monetarily incentivize them if they have the conversation. And we thought that would be a game changer. But it really, the studies have shown, the research has shown that it really didn't have such an impact. But what has become very impactful is the specialty of palliative care in the hospital setting, where, now it's required that physicians have to attend X amount of training per year around palliative care. And I think that has kind of changed the tide. And I think the same should be held true for the administrators and nursing home leaders, that there should be a requirement for them to attend webinars to broaden their approach to end of life.
Thank you. And we have one more. I think this would be tailored towards you, Gretchen. When you go in for surgery and the hospital asks if you have a living will, are there resources on hand at the hospital that'll help you get your wishes written down if you don't already have one? If not, why do they ask?
I think I'm going to start with the second question first. So there's a reason hospitals ask, and that's because it's a law. And it's a law called the Patient Self-Determination Act, which was passed in the late 90s. And the law says that any hospital that accepts federal funding, and all hospitals do because they take Medicare and Medicaid, both of which have at least some funding from the federal government, is required to ask when you get admitted to the hospital if you have an advance directive or a living will. The funny thing about the law is they're not required to do much else. I think most hospitals will ask to see the advance directive or to have a copy of it so they can put it in their files. But even that piece is not as heavily required as just the ask. Many hospitals will have resources on hand. They'll have people in social work or case management who can come and talk to you about creating an advance directive. I have to tell you that those resources are often pretty bare bones in comparison to the beautiful resources that Tacey was showing you. They don't, they're sort of like, here's the paperwork, fill it out. Whereas the resources Tacey had real sort of step-by-step process to help you think and work through these things. It's very hard to do, I would think, in the moment in the hospital. And when it's just a piece of paper saying, I want this or I don't want this, that's a much harder thing to do in the moment. So that's why they ask. And the short answer to do they have resources is ish. They sort of have resources. Yeah. I'm sure some hospitals have amazing resources, but I haven't worked in that hospital and I love my hospital.
All right, and one more over here. Is a DNR part of the advance directive, and where does naming a medical proxy fit in?
It really depends on the form, but most that I have seen have those two components in it. I know we didn't talk about the POST. Here in New Jersey, it's a practitioner order of life-sustaining treatment. And it usually completed by a physician and the family. And it does address the DNR status and also medical treatments that you want or don't want. And that becomes a permanent part of your record, an order, versus an advance directive, which is a document that really guides, but it's not really considered an order. So yes, their DNR is addressed in those forms, including the post.
Yeah. And just to add to that, DNR is probably a little bit different in each state, but it's a small piece of this idea of planning ahead, right? It's what you would want in the setting of a cardiac arrest or when your heart stops. But there are bigger pieces that you might want to talk about as well. And Tacey was talking about that with something called a post. But there are other pieces like, would you want to be on a ventilator or have a feeding tube? Or how would you want to be taken care of if you have a terminal illness? And all that comes under this sort of large umbrella of, in advance, how can we learn enough about you now to know how to take care of you in the future? And some of that's about DNR, and then there's this whole other world of other things. So it's complicated for sure, and yet the idea behind it's really simple, which is I need to know enough about you now, so in the future, I can do my best by you.
I also want to just comment around the healthcare proxy, because I think it's a very important piece of information, that your healthcare proxy doesn't always automatically need to be your partner. And let me give you an example. My sister-in-law died at age 50 of colon cancer. And she didn't want my brother to be her healthcare proxy because he was not accepting of her wishes. And so she named her sister because she knew that she would advocate for her in terms of what her wishes were. My brother had a really hard time letting her go and accepting the fact that she was dying. So just, a word of caution to think through, who are you naming as your healthcare proxy? Will they be able to, speak for you and not, impose their belief systems on what should be done or not done in the end?
Thank you. And we are running out of time, so I just want to let everyone know that if there's a question that you have that goes unanswered, please feel free to email me at dwilcox@njhcqi.org after the program, and I'll get as many questions answered as I can. So sticking on the topic of the DNR, is it common that the DNR is not always followed if a life-sustaining decision has to be made by an attending physician that's not familiar with the patient? No?
I think we can have confidence that if you have a DNR order, that people are not going to do CPR when you have a heart, when your heart stops beating. But the problem is, and we want this, right? We don't want it to determine all the other types of care that you might want. And so sometimes people will get other types of care, but that's not related to what we do when your heart stops. So I think that sometimes there's a misunderstanding that just because you have a DNR order doesn't mean that there aren't other things that you might want. And so physicians are really careful to make sure that when they're making decisions, they don't rely on the DNR order to tell them about other things that you might want. And so I think there is some confusion there, but I don't think it means that people who have a DNR order routinely get CPR when their heart stops.
I have to agree with you. In the hospital setting, once there's a DNR order, people know that, the hospital staff knows that, but the little difference that I have to say in the skilled nursing facility, sometimes not only will they have a DNR, but the family may choose a DNH, do not hospitalize, where if somebody, say it's someone with end-stage dementia, no quality of life, they're not able to eat, they're pretty much dependent on other people, and now they've developed a respiratory infection. I've seen so many times, and it's so sad, this recurring rehospitalization because they ship the patient to the hospital, get IV antibiotics, treat them, back to the skilled nursing facility, when in fact some of the families have decided, you know what, we're just going to make her a DNH, do not hospitalize, which means, and they could also say on their advance directive, I don't want to be treated anymore for infection. And in fact, that's what we did with my mother-in-law. She developed urinary tract infection, and we didn't treat it, and that was, she just went in her sleep. And otherwise we would have, if we've chosen the, hospitalization route, we could have just seen this vicious cycle of her going in and out of the hospital. So there are many different other, besides DNR, there's a DNH, there's a DNI, do not intubate, things that you should consider and talk about with your healthcare providers.
Thank you for that. It seems that we are out of time, so I just want to say thank you again to Gretchen and Tacey so much for those presentations. Everyone seems to have enjoyed the information that you guys conveyed, so I just want to say thank you all for attending, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
Please stay safe.